He was tethered to a deteriorating fence, drenched by precipitation, disregarded by passing vehicles, and seemingly erased from the world's memory. For several days, a German shepherd remained unmoving outside a shuttered shelter, his cries carried by the wind. These vocalizations stemmed not from apprehension, but from a much more profound emotion. He possessed no name, no history, and no prospect of rescue, only suffering. Then, a reserved individual pulled his vehicle to the opposite side of the thoroughfare and performed an act no one else had ventured. The events that ensued would unravel a perplexing situation, put a bond to the test, and demonstrate the remarkable extent to which loyalty can guide a damaged spirit towards renewal. If you hold a belief in the quiet efficacy of second chances and the unvoiced affection between a human and a canine, continue with us. This narrative is truly worth your time. Precipitation in Redwood, Oregon, wasn't a fleeting event. It permeated, seeping into the very core of the town, much like a persistent, unshakable recollection. At the town's periphery, where vegetation encroached upon signage and silence had supplanted compassion, an aged animal shelter stood behind a secured gate. The closure was intended to be brief: renovations, postponements, financial constraints. However, the passage of time did not halt for administrative processes, and secured to that very fence, thoroughly soaked and trembling, was a male German shepherd. He wore no identification, no collar, merely a length of rope, worn thin by wind and exposure, cutting into fur that had likely not been groomed for an extended period. He did not bark, nor did he whimper. Instead, he emitted long, sorrowful howls that cut through the fog and prompted passers-by to raise their car windows a bit more quickly. Perhaps they presumed someone else would address the situation. Perhaps they felt it was not their responsibility. Yet one thing was undeniable: no one intervened. Not on the first day, nor the second, nor the third. The dog stood as a living testament to neglect, pacing in slow circles, his paws abraded by the gravel. Mud caked his legs like restraints. Even the sustenance someone had hastily thrown nearby on the second day remained untouched. He wasn't experiencing hunger. He was anticipating. His gaze was fixed on every passing vehicle, as if searching for a particular, familiar sight. On the fourth evening, the wind intensified significantly. Tree limbs swayed, power lines vibrated, and still he remained, bound only by inattention. A truck decelerated in the vicinity, an old, rust-colored Ford bearing dents that narrated their own histories. The engine continued to run. The headlights remained steady. Inside, a man sat motionless, observing, not with inquisitiveness, not even with commiseration. Something different, perhaps recognition or maybe empathy. He did not avert his gaze. Not for a moment. Elliot Granger was 56, a mechanic whose existence was largely overlooked by the residents of Redwood. He was the type of individual who communicated more effectively with tools than with his fellow townspeople. He avoided taking chances. He avoided stray canines. Yet, something about this particular dog resonated with a deeply suppressed part of him, a silence he had coexisted with for years, a silence that bore a striking resemblance to the one confronting him through the chain-link barrier. Without conscious deliberation, Elliot exited his truck and traversed the street. His footwear made squelching sounds in the mud as he neared cautiously, his hands in plain sight, his stance unthreatening. The dog did not issue a growl. He did not attempt to flee. He merely stared, wide-eyed and unmoving, a combination of weariness and an improbable flicker of trust. Elliot squatted down, near enough to perceive the faint tremor in the atmosphere separating them. The rope was cinched tighter than necessary, secured with a double, not as if someone was determined to prevent his escape. Elliot glanced towards the closed shelter, then back at the street. No observers, no assistance. He reached into his pocket and retrieved an old utility knife. The blade deployed with a click that caused the dog's ears to twitch. A single cut. That was all it required. The rope fell away. For a moment, nothing transpired. Then the dog sat. He didn't run. He didn't snap. He simply sat, his shoulders slumped, his chest rising and falling as if he had been holding his breath for days. Elliot blinked. Well, he mumbled, more to himself than to the dog, suppose you're accompanying me. He opened the truck door. The dog paused, cast one final glance at the vacant road, then entered the vehicle without a sound. There was no tail wag, no indication of joy, just a silence that now enveloped two beings. Elliot had not intended to rescue anyone that day. He was merely in town for brake pads and a new wrench socket, ordinary tasks for a man who had structured his life around predictability and solitude. But destiny has a peculiar way of infiltrating the mundane. And somehow that single, silent look from the German shepherd seated beside him initiated a fissure within him. Not a wide, dramatic breach, but just enough to permit something unfamiliar to enter. The journey back to Elliot's residence was characterized by quietness. Not the serene variety, but rather a silence that seemed hesitant to find its voice. The dog remained upright and motionless, his damp coat saturating the passenger seat. His eyes blinked infrequently. He did not investigate his surroundings. He did not pant, merely gazing ahead as if finding it difficult to believe the ride was genuine. Elliot was never skilled at casual conversation. He made no attempt to assign the dog a name or offer comforting reassurances. Instead, he drove more slowly than his usual pace, navigating curves with caution as though haste might disrupt the delicate trust forming within the truck. His home was a modest cabin situated just beyond the redwood tree line. It lacked aesthetic appeal but possessed a sturdy construction built by Elliot's own hands after an excessive number of years in environments where everything eventually disintegrated. It was the sort of dwelling where the sound of a kettle reaching a boil could obscure one's regrets. He opened the front door and allowed the dog ample space. No leash, no instructions, no preconceived notions, just an open door and a softly spoken, "all right." The dog did not enter hastily. He crossed the threshold with deliberate steps, one paw at a time, as if assessing the floor for potential betrayal. Then he halted in the center of the room, his eyes lowered, his shoulders hunched, not in a cowering manner, but with a wariness indicative of someone repeatedly hurt by subsequent events. Elliot placed an old towel near the stove and retrieved a bowl of water. He slid it across the wooden floor without uttering a word. The dog sniffed it but refrained from drinking. His attention remained fixed on Elliot, not with fear, but with vigilance, as if attempting to discern the nature of this human. Evidently not the type to secure him to a fence. Nevertheless, the dog did not lower his guard. Not yet. As the stove ignited, suffusing the room with a gentle orange luminescence, Elliot seated himself at his workbench and continued repairing a carburetor. His hands moved with ingrained skill, his eyes intermittently flicking towards the dog. He was unaccustomed to companionship, particularly of the kind that stared with such profound stillness. The dog did not roam or explore. He simply lay down near the stove, coiling his body tightly as if attempting to vanish into himself. The quiet was substantial but not unpleasant. It was the sort of silence in which two injured beings shared the same respiration. Elliot had experienced loneliness before, the kind that didn't manifest in shouts or tears, but rather sat with you, slowly and persistently, like background interference one couldn't eliminate. Observing the dog, he recognized the same burden, albeit in a different manifestation. Raw, recent, still hemorrhaging in unseen places. That evening, the dog did not consume the food. He did not whimper or bark. He merely watched the door, anticipating someone's arrival, perhaps the wrong someone's return. Elliot observed this. He posed no questions but made a mental note. The dog had not ceased looking towards the door since the moment he entered the house. Before retiring for the night, Elliot filled a second bowl, this time with warm broth remaining from his own meal. He positioned it closer than the previous one. The dog sniffed, took a tentative sip, then another small, cautious lap. Progress. Elliot extinguished the lights and left the door slightly ajar, in case the dog needed to depart. But the dog remained motionless. When the cabin descended into darkness, he stayed where the fire's warmth touched the floor, breathing softly, his eyes finally closing. Not in comfort, but in surrender, just for that night. Outside, the rain resumed, heavier this time, with distant thunder. But inside, for the first time in a considerable while, two souls slept under the same roof, both uncertain of what the morrow would hold, yet strangely prepared to confront it together. The sun had not yet pierced the cloud cover when Elliot stepped onto the porch the following morning. Damp pine needles coated the steps, and the air carried the scent of moist earth and corrosion. He hadn't anticipated significant change, but he immediately perceived a difference. The dog was no longer curled by the stove. He was awake, upright, and observing Elliot from the identical spot. No wagging tail, no barking, just those quiet, discerning eyes. Elliot poured his coffee and seated himself across the room, casting a glance at the untouched bowl of kibble from the previous night. "Particular, are we?" he mumbled. The dog blinked. Elliot chuckled softly, but the amusement was fleeting. It was too early in their developing bond to feign that either of them was entirely well. He occupied the morning with tasks in the garage out back. The rain had subsided to a mist, gentle enough to hear birdsong once more, yet substantial enough to maintain a pervasive grayness as he worked to loosen a corroded bolt on an old V6 engine. Elliot detected a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye, the dog positioned just within the doorway, neither fully entering nor departing, simply observing. It was as if the animal had developed a spectral instinct, to watch without intervening, to remain close yet not too close, to exist without occupying excessive space. Periodically, Elliot would casually inquire, "You all right?" Or, "Ever seen a carburetor this deteriorated?" He didn't anticipate responses, but the routine rendered the silence less acute. It was an unusual interaction, two beings circling one another with unseen barriers, yet connected by an intangible element neither could identify. That evening, Elliot grilled a piece of chicken on the cast iron skillet and sliced off a portion for the dog. He placed the plate near the wood stove without any fuss. This time, the dog did not pause, nor did he gulp it down. He chewed slowly, with deliberation, like someone finally permitted to savor a meal but not entirely certain it would last. It was during that tranquil mealtime, as Elliot leaned back in his creaking kitchen chair, that the first sound emerged. A low growl, not aimed at Elliot, but towards the front window. The dog was on his feet, rigid as steel, his gaze fixed on the glass, ears erect, tail lowered, no barking, just a deep primal admonition emanating from the core of a creature that had witnessed too much. Elliot walked over and peered out. Nothing, just mist swirling over the gravel road. No vehicles, no people, only the trees swaying as if privy to a secret they were not yet prepared to disclose. "Probably a raccoon," he stated, though his voice lacked certainty. The dog remained vigilant for another minute before returning to his blanket, his eyes still directed towards the front. That night, Elliot secured all the locks on the doors, not due to a belief in imminent threats, but because he suddenly felt he possessed something worthy of safeguarding. He climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet once more, but this silence felt distinct. Not an emptiness, but a presence. Someone else was now breathing under this roof, someone carrying histories etched into his very being. And whether Elliot wished to acknowledge it or not, that burden was no longer solely the dog's. He had assumed some of it himself without understanding how, why, or what the cost might be. At approximately 3 a.m., Elliot was roused by a soft whimper, not alarmed, not loud, just the sort of sound one makes when nightmares refuse to relinquish their hold. He didn't rise. He didn't need to. The sound ceased on its own, as if the dog had suppressed it. Elliot closed his eyes again, his jaw tense. No words had been exchanged between them, not even a name. Yet somehow that silence felt more potent than anything either of them could have articulated. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was something. And whatever it was, it had already found a place in the quiet recesses of Elliot's life. Morning arrived gradually through the dense covering of redwood pine trees. Light filtered in softly, illuminating the time-worn wooden floor and creating long shadows across the cabin walls. The dog was awake before Elliot, already positioned near the stove like a guard who never took a break. His ears twitched at every creak of the house, every pop of a floorboard, every squirrel scurrying across the roof. Hyper-alert scarcely began to capture his state. It was as if, in this dog's world, rest had to be merited, and he didn't believe he had accumulated sufficient credit. Elliot sat on the edge of his bed for a prolonged moment, rubbing the back of his neck before finally rising. He shuffled into the kitchen, poured 2 cups of black coffee, only one of which served a genuine purpose, and turned to glance at the dog, who remained frozen in the same guarded stance. That wasn't a typical morning gaze. It wasn't inquisitiveness. It was watchfulness tinged with a kind of trauma Elliot recognized, though he would never voice it. He set the coffee down and walked over, crouching slowly a few feet from the dog. No abrupt movements, no reaching out, just presence. His voice was soft, raspy from sleep. You continue looking like that and I'll start believing I owe you rent. The dog's eyes flicked towards him, then back to the front door. Elliot sighed, stood, and reached for a towel. Come on, you reek. He gently coaxed the dog towards the back porch where a rusted bucket awaited. Warm water, mild soap, and a significant amount of trust, that's all this was going to require. Easier stated than accomplished. The instant Elliot reached out with the towel, the dog tensed. Every muscle tightened beneath his soaked fur, not from fear, but from recollection. This wasn't unfamiliar to him, this was something he anticipated would go awry. Still, he didn't bite, didn't growl. He simply tolerated it as if accustomed to pain that left no visible marks. As Elliot ran the cloth over the dog's neck, his hand paused. Something beneath the fur felt abnormal. Not just matted hair scars, ridges that shouldn't be there. Long-heeled welts, as if a collar had once been cinched so tightly it left indelible impressions. Beneath that, fresher damage, faded lines that appeared too clean, too precise. Not random injuries, not accidents, patterns. He swallowed hard, attempting to maintain a casual tone. Someone certainly didn't want you straying far. But the remark landed with a gravity he couldn't disregard. By the time the washing concluded, the dog's fur had fluffed slightly, revealing more of his physique. He was lean, excessively so, built like a fighter who never received a respite between bouts. Elliot grabbed an old sweatshirt, draped it across the porch railing to dry his hands, and leaned against the wall, observing the dog without staring too intently. Looks like somebody exploited you, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone. And you still returned to the fence. The dog turned then, for the first time, and met Elliot's gaze directly. It was only for a second, but it was sufficient to convey everything words could not. Something transpired between them, an unspoken acknowledgement. Not gratitude, not forgiveness, just recognition, as if both of them had finally been perceived by something that understood. Inside the house, Elliot retrieved a small first aid kit and arranged a few bandages and ointments on the table. He wasn't a veterinarian, but he wasn't entirely ignorant either. As he carefully applied ointment to the most irritated spot on the dog's shoulder, he noticed something peculiar. The dog didn't flinch. He didn't react at all. He simply kept his gaze forward, calm and detached, as if anticipating the pain, as if he had been conditioned not to react. That's what unsettled Elliot the most, not the wounds themselves, but the dog's acceptance of them. After tidying up, Elliot sat back with his coffee and stared out the window. Something was amiss. This dog wasn't merely abandoned. He wasn't lost. He had been placed, left somewhere specific, for a reason. As if someone didn't want to care for him but also didn't want him too distant. And that, more than the scars, more than the silence, sent a chilling sensation through Elliot's spine. There was a story behind this dog, buried deep beneath the fur and the silence. And Elliot was beginning to realize he wasn't certain he wanted to uncover it. But something indicated he no longer had a choice. Because whatever that story was, it hadn't concluded at that fence. Not by a long shot. The wind made its return that evening as if it had unresolved matters. It didn't merely rustle foliage, it whispered through the trees, brushing the cabin's windows with an eerie stillness that made one's skin question whether a sound was real or imagined. Elliot, seated on the porch with his boots propped up and his coffee long cold, no longer felt entirely alone. Not in a peaceful, comforting manner. No, this was different. This was the kind of aloneness that felt observed. The dog sat nearby, back straight, ears erect, tail low, and utterly motionless. He hadn't shifted in 10 minutes. Every sound, every snap of a twig, every gust of wind elicited a flicker in his gaze, but his body remained frozen as if calculating whether this was the moment to flee or remain. Elliot had resided on this land for over a decade. He was familiar with the local sounds: foxes, squirrels, wind, rain. But tonight, something felt unnatural, deliberate. And the dog's reaction did little to ease his unease. No barking, no growling, just focus, intense, tight-jawed focus, as if he recalled this rhythm from a place no dog should ever have to experience. Then it occurred. A sharp noise from the rear of the property. Not close, but not distant enough. A scraping sound, metal against wood. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't wildlife. It was human. Elliot rose slowly, setting his cup down, and looked towards the old fence line where the shed met the forest. The dog didn't move from his spot, but his body leaned slightly towards the sound. Not fear or readiness. Elliot retrieved the flashlight from inside and headed towards the noise, the dog at his heel, shadowing him without a command. The beam of light swept across pine trunks, piles of rusted tools, and finally, something unusual. A branch had been pulled downward, secured with something rope. He stepped closer. The knot was frayed as if recently cut. Lying just below it in the damp soil was a small plastic tag, cracked and blank as if it had been scrubbed clean. "What in the blazes?" Elliot whispered. The dog's growl returned, not loud, but guttural, a low, vibrating warning emanating from deep within his chest. He wasn't reacting to the rope, he was reacting to the space beyond it, the trees, the path that vanished into darkness. Elliot took one more glance around and slowly retreated. They returned to the cabin in silence, securing the door behind them, every lock. Later that night, Elliot stood at the sink, washing his hands, when he saw movement in the reflection of the window. Not distinct, not swift, but real. A shape near the edge of the property line, standing still before disappearing behind a tree. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did the dog. And by morning, new footprints appeared in the mud, adult-sized, wide strides leading just close enough to the porch before turning back. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been there. Someone who knew precisely where the dog had gone. And worse, they weren't attempting to break in. They were observing, waiting for what Elliot didn't yet know. But something told him the most difficult part of the dog's story wasn't what had already transpired, it was what was still to come. Elliot disliked unresolved situations. He was a man of nuts and bolts, electrical wiring, compression ratios, things that became clear with sufficient scrutiny. But dog was not a mechanical device, he was a puzzle with absent borders and pieces too damaged to reassemble. And the indicators, the rope, the tag, the movement in the woods were not haphazard. They were intentional, interconnected. Someone knew dog's exact whereabouts and they were drawing nearer. So Elliot undertook an action he hadn't performed in years. He went into town. He disliked crowds. He distrusted idle talk, but he did trust the local veterinarian, Dr. Laney Rowe, a woman who had mended more farm dogs and barn cats than anyone else in Redwood County. She operated from a renovated farmhouse just off Highway 14, no frills, no condemnation, just care. Dog sat calmly in the passenger seat as they drove, not panting, not agitated, just observing the road with a sort of hollow vigilance as if anticipating the world might capsize at any moment. Laney greeted them at the entrance with an arched eyebrow. "Since when are you a dog owner?" Elliot didn't correct her. "He's not mine," he stated bluntly. "But I believe someone is searching for him. And not in a benevolent way." The examination room smelled of disinfectant and cedar. Dog didn't flinch at the cold table. He didn't resist the thermometer, the gentle inspection of his paws, his ribs. But when Laney reached for the fur around his neck, his body tensed. No growl, just that coiled rigidity again, like the moment before a storm decides whether to unleash its fury. She brushed his fur back and paused. "Elliot," she said, her voice lower now, "come take a look." There, beneath the dense patch of fur, was a scar shaped like a triangle, deep, not accidental. A brand. Laney's expression darkened. "I've encountered this once previously. A rescue arrived about a year ago. Similar marking. The dog had been retrieved from a fight ring near Corvallis. They utilized it to track ownership like livestock." Elliot's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting he was compelled to fight, or bred for it, or conditioned for something worse? These operations are deeply entrenched. Some are barely dismantled before they re-emerge elsewhere." She scanned dog again, running a microchip reader across his back and neck. Nothing. No identification. Whoever possessed him didn't want him traced. Dog sat there, still and quiet, as if the room wasn't filled with the gravity of that pronouncement, as if being forgotten was something he had already reconciled himself to. Elliot said nothing, his fists clenched around the edge of the table. Laney leaned in closer to inspect another mark just beneath the dog's shoulder. "This scar is recent, perhaps 2 weeks old. That's approximately when you found him." He nodded. "Whoever had him, they didn't just discard him. They placed him. That shelter fence wasn't arbitrary." Elliot felt the pieces reconfiguring in his mind, the rope, the tag, the figure in the trees. They hadn't lost dog, they'd left him as enticement or as a communication. On the drive home, the silence between man and dog was more profound than ever, not uncomfortable, just laden with realization. Dog had endured something dark, something that didn't conclude when he walked away from that fence. And now, whatever had harmed him once was circling back. That night, Elliot didn't prepare a meal. He didn't tidy up. He sat at the table with his laptop open, a device he hadn't used in months. He scoured articles, blogs, old forum discussions, anything connected to dog fighting in Oregon. And then, just past midnight, he found it, an old thread on a whistleblower website concealed beneath pseudonyms and fragmented sentences. It mentioned a ranch 2 towns away, shut down 6 months prior, dozens of dogs rescued, a few unaccounted for. Attached to the post was a photograph, blurry, taken at night. But in the bottom left corner, barely discernible, stood a German shepherd, scar on the shoulder, bent ear, same eyes. Dog. It wasn't just his trauma Elliot had taken in that day, it was his unfinished story. And now Elliot was a part of it too. The rain did not seek consent this time. It arrived in torrents, lashing sideways against the cabin, pounding the roof like an admonition. The kind of storm that obliterated thoughts and compelled quiet men like Elliot to sit bolt upright at 3 a.m. and listen with heightened intensity. That night, tranquil slumber was an impossibility. He sat at the kitchen table with a thermos of black coffee and Dog curled beside his boots, eyes half closed but vigilant, perpetually vigilant. The sort of sleep he experienced came in fleeting seconds, not extended hours, as if his instincts forbade him from fully disengaging just in case someone or something returned. And tonight, something did. It commenced with the crunch of gravel beneath slow-moving tires. Not speeding, not racing, just rolling deliberately down the narrow dirt track leading to Elliot's property. There were no neighbors at this extremity of the woods. No lost tourists, no delivery vehicles in such a deluge. Elliot's stomach dropped as headlights sliced through the tree lean, pausing just long enough to illuminate the porch before extinguishing. The truck did not depart. It simply remained there. Engine off, lights off, observing. Elliot moved towards the front window, his eyes narrowed, his heart thudding, but his face remained impassive. He didn't reach for a telephone. He didn't summon anyone. Instead, he turned to the tool rack near the door and grasped a steel shovel, well-used, well-balanced, and suddenly more reassuring than any firearm. Dog stood, not with fear, but with resolve. He walked to the front door without a sound, pressed his nose to the gap beneath it, and emitted that low, growling rumble Elliot now recognized as a warning. Not a bluff, not bravado, truth. Elliot cracked the door open and stepped onto the porch, shovel in hand, rain battering his coat. The night absorbed sound, but he could sense it, the tension, the electricity, the presence of someone who hadn't come to converse. There was a figure near the tree lean, too distant to discern clearly, but close enough to be unmistakably human. The silhouette was tall, bulky, wearing a hat or hood. He stood like someone accustomed to such encounters. Staring, waiting. Elliot shouted into the storm, "Do you have business here?" No response. Dog pushed the door open wider, stepping beside Elliot, shoulder tense, eyes locked forward. The figure didn't speak. Instead, they slowly raised something and tossed it forward. A plastic bag landed with a dull thud in the mud between them. Then, without a word, the man turned and vanished into the woods. Elliot didn't move for a long second. Then, cautiously, he stepped forward and opened the bag. Inside was a collar, worn leather, cracked, blood-stained. The tag had been scratched nearly clean. But there was one word left, still visible through the scarring: grit. Elliot looked at Dog, now Grit, and saw the recognition flash in his eyes. But it wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It was dread. As if hearing the name aloud brought back things he'd spent weeks trying to bury. This wasn't just someone looking for a lost dog. This was someone staking a claim. Someone making a statement. Back in the cabin, Elliot dried the collar and set it on the mantel. Grit didn't go near it. He lay down facing the door, refusing to look away, as if sleep would cost him something he couldn't afford. Elliot didn't sit. He paced. Every now and then he'd stare at the trees outside, trying to understand what this man wanted. Why now? Why here? And then it hit him. The man hadn't come to take the dog back. He'd come to remind Elliot that he never truly let Grit go. Whatever Grit had escaped from hadn't stopped hunting. And by cutting that rope, Elliot had stepped into a storm that wouldn't pass easily. But storms have a way of revealing what's built to last. And Elliot wasn't planning on losing him. Not now, not ever. Morning offered no respite. The storm had abated, but the gravity of what transpired lingered over the cabin like a persistent fog. Elliot did not eat. He did not repair anything. He simply sat on the porch steps, his boots soaked from dew, observing the edge of the trees as if daring them to stir again. Grit lay at his side, stretched out yet vigilant, his chin resting on his paws, his ears attuned to every sound like a soldier awaiting orders that might never arrive. The preceding night had altered something. This was no longer about fear. It wasn't even about inquisitiveness. It was about establishing a boundary. And Elliot, the man who had spent years evading attachments, had just formed his first one in decades. Midday arrived with an unnerving quiet. No vehicles, no birdsong, no wind, just stillness. Then, a sound. Not loud, not abrupt, just the unmistakable crunch of tires against gravel once more. But this time, they didn't halt at the periphery. This time, the truck proceeded all the way down the long dirt path and parked. Elliot stood. The door opened slowly. A man emerged, mid-40s, broad build, weathered countenance, dressed as if he had just departed a construction site. But it was his eyes that most unsettled Elliot, cold, calculating, and already surveying the yard before he even uttered a word. He did not introduce himself. He did not inquire about directions. He simply looked down at Grit and stated, "He belongs to me." Elliot's voice remained low. "Not any longer." The man's jaw tensed. He was marked. "That signifies he returns. That's the protocol." Grit rose slowly, his body rigid. He did not bark. He did not whimper. But the way he positioned himself between the man and Elliot conveyed everything that needed to be expressed. The man smirked. "Still devoted. I instilled that in him." Elliot stepped forward, shovel in hand. "You instilled in him the endurance of pain. Devotion he acquired on his own." There was a pause, just long enough for the moment to feel like a compressed spring. Then the man took another step forward and Grit reacted explosively. Not with violence, not with fury, but with purpose. He lunged between them, his stance defensive, not attacking, but obstructing. His body was a shield and every fiber of his being declared, "You will not take me again." The man froze, taken aback by the resistance. Grit did not snarl. He did not break his stare. He just stood firm, like a monument to everything the man had attempted to break and failed to. Elliot raised the shovel slightly, not to strike, but as a line drawn in steel. "You come one step nearer, and I'll ensure the only collar you depart with is around your wrists." And just like that, the dynamic shifted. The man didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just sneered, turned back towards the truck, and spat in the mud. "He won't forget. Dogs like him never do." Elliot replied, steady and sure, "Good, because neither do I." The truck reversed slowly, its wheels digging tracks into the earth, and disappeared into the woods. They stood there for a long while after, Elliot and Grit, still quiet, staring into the emptiness where the truck had been. Then Grit sat down, not with fear, not with panic, but with the kind of exhale that says, "It's concluded." Not the healing, not the memory, but the threat. That night, Grit ate 2 full bowls without flinching. He slept belly up near the stove, twitching once in his dreams, not with fear, but perhaps finally with peace. And Elliot, he carved a small nameplate out of scrap metal and nailed it to the front gate. It read, "Grit, free, proud, home." Some wounds don't vanish. Some stories don't resolve neatly. But every now and then, a broken thing finds another broken thing.